It's Tuesday, October 25th, 2022, and welcome back to GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast examining social, economic, political, and geopolitical concerns. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm a Hoover Distinguished Policy Fellow, and I'll be your moderator today, watching a conversation featuring three of my colleagues we call Hoover's GoodFellows. That would be the historian Niall Ferguson, the economist John Cochrane, the geostrategist Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. They are Hoover Institution Senior Fellows all. H.R., I'm starting with you because our producer Scott Immigrant sent around a rather distressing retweet the other day, linking the Philadelphia Phillies of all things to economic misery, pointing out that in years that the Phillies go to the World Series, America ends up in either a depression or a recession. So HR is a native Philadelphian, and the many insults thrown that city's way. Is it really fair to blame Philadelphia for the nation's economy?
Of course not. But hey, look at the bright side. If we're going to go to a recession anyway, you might as well have the Phillies win the World Series, right? So I think we have to. I've been cast the role of the optimist on the show. That's the optimistic side of this.
Okay, Neil, John, as we get closer to the election, are there any kind of goofy indexes you guys look at? We here in America, we go overboard with these things. We look at sports, we look at bake sales, we look at all kinds of crazy ways to predict elections. Is there anything you guys seriously take note of?
Well, you've hit your finger on the replication crisis in empirical economics and how to key hack results that are eminently publishable if you keep trying in appropriate journals. No, I don't believe in astrology. In fact, these days, actual surveys and polling is more and more suspicious.
Okay, so the fault lies not in our stars, but in our candidates. So this is the last GoodFellows for October. So for this episode, I thought we might want to look at things through the prism of Red October, which is a phrase going around American politics these days, reflecting Republicans' improving fortunes in the upcoming midterm election, which is now 2 weeks from today's recording. You look around the country, the generic ballot, the House races, Senate races, Republican candidates are showing an uptick. The website 538.com, which takes polling data and turns that into political prognostication, now gives Republicans an 81% chance of winning the House, only 45% in the Senate. So let's begin the show with the premise that Republicans have control of at least half, if not all, of Congress. And let's apply what they do with that power. John Cochrane put it very well the other day. It's the question of the dog chasing the car, finally catching the car. What does the dog do? What do Republicans do with power, and how does it apply to a few things we like to talk about here on GoodFellows? And Neil and John, why don't we talk about this in regards to what's going on in the UK? You're a Republican member of Congress in 2023, and you're looking at what's happening with the UK economy. How do you apply that to the American economy?
Yes, they are the dog that caught the car. And what does the Republican Party in the U.S. mean? I think is the great open question. Democrats, when you have the administration, you kind of know what they are, what they're going to do. So is the Republican Party national conservative, whatever that means, a singularly poorly chosen title for its historical references? Are they party of big government that helps or comes to pretend to help the working class, whatever that means? Or are we back to the thing that actually works, free markets, return to constitutional order, low taxes and so forth? The UK just went through this spectacular experiment where Liz Truss tried to revive Reagan-Thatcher economics, which on the economics merits, I think she's exactly right. You have a very slow-growing economy. The idea that you need more stimulus is ludicrous because inflation is going 10%. So the only way out of this is to remove all the sand in the gears of the supply side of the economy. As right as the economics was, the politics of it was absolutely catastrophic. The politics and the messaging, they sold it as Keynesian stimulus. They weren't willing to use the word incentive in their own propaganda. So if you don't believe your own ideas, I don't know what's happening. And then, of course, sequencing it by starting with tiny little tax cuts that nonetheless are like clickbait to all the standard intelligentsia who says no, 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 no. And the lack, we had a great communicator in Reagan and an iron lady in Thatcher, and Liz Truss proved to be none of these. Now, what does that mean for the U.S.? Is there a chance for? There's no chance in the UK now for, and I'll hear Neil tell me I'm wrong, but I hope I'm wrong, for a serious growth-oriented policy to take over, at least out of the conservatives, for a generation. Is there a chance for the U.S. Republicans to turn to a serious growth-oriented policy? I would hope so, but we at least have an abject lesson in how not to do it.
Well, my view is that conservatives need to be very careful about emphasizing fiscal policy in the wake of a financial crisis a bout of fiscal irresponsibility for its own sake. And then, of course, the current inflationary crisis, which I guess has its origins in the pandemic. It's very difficult when you've really cranked up the debt to GDP ratio to then say, we are the conservatives and we're all about tax cuts. Because, John, you won't deny, I hope, that there's some pretty nasty fiscal arithmetic for indebted governments running deficits in an atmosphere, in a climate of rising interest rates. So anybody who wants to emphasize fiscal policy at this point is essentially committing political suicide, as Liz Truss discovered. Now, my advice to conservatives on both sides of the Atlantic has been for some time, do not prioritize issues where you can only lose, where you're bound to have to cut spending if you aren't prepared to raise taxes. This is how you lose elections. Right. So don't go there. Focus on the things where the left, where the Democrats or the Labour Party are vulnerable. And those are, broadly speaking, cultural issues. Education, where everybody knows the left has gone mad, wants our children to believe 3 impossible things before recess. Focus on the whole range of issues that really arose during the pandemic of what might broadly be called social control. Take a leaf out of the pages of Glenn Youngkin and Ron DeSantis and go for those issues. You were derogatory a moment ago, John, about national conservatism, but if national conservatism means anything, it means fighting and winning the culture war when you know that the majority of ordinary people really aren't woke. And therefore, it's relatively easy to peel them away from the left by pointing out the lunacies that the people on the left want them to believe, that there are 53 genders, that it's actually anti-racism systematically to discriminate against people on the basis of race, and so on. So the conservatives in Britain made a very, very basic mistake. They thought that politics was still about taxes in conditions where you simply can't easily cut them. They didn't realize that it's not the 1980s anymore. It's the 2020s. And in the 2020s, politics is about culture. And that's how you get voters to turn away from the left. I warned British conservatives about this in the summer and they wouldn't listen. And here they are.
I want to, Neil, I want to mostly agree and gently disagree. You're exactly right on how to peel voters away from left. But then you, the dog that caught the car, you need to do something about it. And part of that something has to be about economic policy, not just the culture wars. And you have to explain, so tax cuts are, if you are a supply sider, what matters is tax rates, not taxes. And you have to be able to explain this slowly and patiently. Even in the UK, 45% income tax, 20% VAT, these add on each other. Social insurance taxes, property taxes. You're lucky if you earn an extra pound that you get to spend 30 or 40 cents of it, pence, sorry. And, those disincentives are the corporate taxes are about keeping companies. You have to be, so the eventual right answer is lower rates and broader base. Now, that doesn't come first, and you're exactly right. Not just can you look out the window and see culture wars that are plainly silly. You can look out the window and see that you can't get building permits. The left is looking out the window and saying we can't get transmission line permits. All the ways in which the sand is in the gears of the microeconomy is abundantly clear to both. And that would not just peel off voters, that would show competence in government. And that was what I was arguing was the place to start with microeconomic policy. Of course, you have to get the inflation under control. And that does require talking about a sound long-run fiscal policy, but that too mostly comes from growth.
Mm-hmm. HR, I looked at the national security and questions of where House Republicans would go with that.
Yes.
Where do we start? Is climate change an existential threat to national security, as the Secretary of Defense would have you believe? Withdrawal from Afghanistan, should there be hearings on that? The ongoing question of American boots on the ground elsewhere. Let's focus HR on Ukraine. Back in July, 30 House Democrats sent a letter to Nancy Pelosi saying that it's time now to engage directly with Russia to settle this. Just the other day, Kevin McCarthy was asked about Ukraine, and he told reporters that, in his words, and I'll quote here, the American voters do not want to, quote, keep writing a blank check to Ukraine. So, HR, what is a sensible policy on Ukraine in 2023?
Well, I think a sensible policy is that we do everything we can to help Ukraine win, and that means convince Vladimir Putin he's been defeated. I do think, as we've talked oftentimes here, that that there is no such thing as an off ramp for Vladimir Putin. It's just a chance for another on ramp. And so I think the more that we recognize that, and it's quite easy to come to that conclusion if you just look at the historical pattern of Putin's aggression going back to 2003, at the least. That's the logical conclusion, that Putin has to be convinced he's been defeated, or else this war will go on and ultimately become more and more costly. What we've seen, I think, already, Bill, and this is what I think have to talk to the American people about, is that these conflicts that develop abroad, don't stay there, don't stay confined to that geographic area, right? We've seen the conflict expand, obviously, with the humanitarian crisis and the refugee crisis, and how that's affected mainly Europe, but even more broadly. And of course, you've seen it with the effect on global energy markets, and especially with Putin's, threat maybe to energy infrastructure, after blowing up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. How about food security? And so I think it's immensely important for us to recognize that these conflicts don't stay confined to where they are, and the outcome of this conflict is in America's interest. It's in America's interest to ensure that Ukraine wins, and by win, I think that means reestablishing control of Ukraine's territory and giving Putin no other option, right? But to engage into some sort of a ceasefire in which Ukraine can consolidate the regaining of its territory and reestablish security.
So I want to ask you both you guys a question. We're going to stay on this topic because we got Ukraine, and we also got this national security strategy, which I want to ask about. But on Ukraine, so I read something real interesting last week that said Putin, it's about domestic politics, and Russia internally is getting much more fragmented. Putin can afford to lose to the U.S., but he can't afford to lose to Ukraine, which was, I don't know if that was an argument for Putin might escalate. I don't know if it was an argument for we might escalate or not. And then the big question, are the Republicans, when they catch the car, going to go isolationist and cut off Ukraine? So 2 questions for you, but I'm curious to know what both of you guys think.
Well, I'll go first. Putin can't afford to lose, period. As a Russian leader, you launch an offensive operation, invade a country such as Ukraine. It doesn't really matter why you lose. If you lose, you're in big trouble historically.
Afghanistan?
Nicholas II. Afghanistan was one of the reasons the Soviet Union fell apart, John. The total corrosion of the legitimacy of the Soviet Union was not just caused by Chernobyl. It was caused by an utterly futile, decade-long attempt to bomb Afghanistan back to the Stone Age, which they pretty much did. Some people confuse our efforts in Afghanistan with the Soviet efforts. This is very ignorant. The Soviets devastated the country. We did a considerable amount to improve its economic and social infrastructure. So that's part one of the answer. Part two of the answer is I think there's a lot of fake news doing the rounds about the domestic politics of Ukraine. About a week ago, there was a headline that Kevin McCarthy was contemplating cutting off funding, or at least reviewing it, if he became Speaker of the House again. On close inspection, that doesn't seem to be true. In fact, the Republicans are arguing that we should increase our commitment to Ukraine, particularly with respect to weapons, so that the Ukrainians have a better shot at winning this war. Remember, we're giving the Ukrainians enough weapons not to lose, but they're not really getting enough to win, right, because they don't have nearly enough armor for their offensive operations to be successful at reasonable cost. And they don't have good defenses against the Iranian drones that the Russians are currently raining down on Ukrainian infrastructure. So the Republicans are actually arguing, rightly, that we need to up our commitment to Ukraine on the military side. It's the Democrats who've gone wobbly, although the progressives who started arguing that there needs to be negotiation have backed away very rapidly from that letter. And the sound of staffers being thrown under buses in Washington is almost audible here on the Stanford campus. I think that's what's really going on. And that reminds us of the most important point in American politics today, and that is the bipartisan consensus on foreign policy that no one dare break. We're told of over and over again, the country's so polarized, everything is partisan. No, there is a consensus on foreign policy that has emerged particularly on the question of China, but I think it also applies to Russia and Ukraine. And it's quite dangerous, actually, to stray from this. Now, here I'm going to throw it to HR. For me, the most striking thing about the administration's new national security strategy document is how like yours it is when you strip away the woke flim-flam that's sort of stuck on there to keep the progressives on board. You know, it's going to be an inclusive national security strategy, But you take that out, and at core, what does it say? There are two major rivals. We're in competition with them. Number one is China. Number two is Russia. You know, I went back and compared the text of your excellent national security strategy document, HR, with this one, and there are surprisingly striking resemblances on the core issues of China and Russia. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do agree, Neil. It is most striking in terms of continuity, especially in the area of great power competition with China, especially, and then Russia as well. And I think it's just undeniable. I mean, I remember, in March of 2017 when we convened the Principals Committee of the National Security Council, and I read excerpts from the Obama administration's China policy, and just noted that we were about to effect the most significant shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, and that's between the strategy of cooperation and engagement under the flawed assumption that China, having been welcomed to the international order, would play by the rules, and as it prospered, it would liberalize its economy and liberalize its form of governance. Okay, who believes that anymore, right? Nobody, except maybe a few people on Wall Street. And we wanted it to be bipartisan from the beginning, Neil. We held roundtable discussions about the national security strategy across party lines with people on the Hill. It was not meant to be a partisan national security strategy. It was the president's. And of course, I'm sure many Democrats took exception, and many Republicans as well, to the America First language, just in terms of the phrase itself. But other than that, I think it's really a document that will stand the test of time, because what we decided to do is to confront the world as it is and recognize the points at which our vital interests were at stake, and to do everything we could from a policy perspective to look for opportunities to preserve peace through strength, to improve our security broadly, to promote prosperity, and to extend American influence in the world. And we did so in recognition that we were far behind in 2017. Neil, John, and Bill. I mean, we had vacated critical arenas of competition under these flawed assumptions about the post-Cold War world, and we were well overdue for a corrective. Now, there is a lot of distracting language in there, I think. Hey, climate change is an issue. Okay, I'm not a climate denier, but to say that is the existential threat that you're facing, I think it sort of lends itself to the hysteria that actually prevents meaningful solutions to the issues of man-made carbon emissions and reductions of man-made carbon emissions and greenhouse gases and addressing climate issues. And then also, some of the language in there that really irked me, was this language about, a scourge of problems within the military, when in fact there is no scourge of these problems. These problems actually appear in terms of, and we're talking about like sexual harassment and assault and various forms of bigotry. They happen at far lesser rates than they do in most of American society. And what I worry about, is this kind of this wokeness and this sort of agenda to change the culture, the military culture, when in fact our military culture is intolerant of those kind of transgressions and crimes. And so I do think that there still is this woke agenda. I mean, it is remarkable that it took so long to get the national security strategy out, but the gender strategy was out, about a year and a half ago. So I do think there's a problem with priorities, but I was heartened to see the continuities in terms of great power competition, and the recognition, that we're behind the competition with China, and the next decade will be consequential in terms of our ability to maintain critical competitive advantages that will allow us to give our children and grandchildren the opportunities that we've had.
Mm-hmm. Is it really flim-flam, though? I mean, I'm really curious. When the national security strategy started with our existential threat is climate. I think we'll go on to energy and climate change as a separate issue. But does everyone just kind of laugh and say, okay, there's a problem for HR for HR thinks every problem can be solved with a tank. I'm not sure that one is, unless maybe it's a battery-powered tank wandering around the hills of Ukraine looking for a charging station. But does it really not matter when so much, you have to strip away so much of the language, say, oh, ha, ha, they don't really mean that. Both the inclusion stuff and the climate is our existential threats.
It's a distraction, right? It's a distraction at the very least. I mean, I think if you read the service secretary's priorities, read the secretary of the Navy's priorities, read the secretary of the Army's priorities, and you think, hey, aren't our services supposed to be able to fight and win wars? Aren't they supposed to be able to demonstrate their ability to do so they deter conflict? And so I think we're in this stage now where we're at risk for what Michael Howard used to describe about militaries in interwar periods, that militaries have a tendency to forget what they're for. And of course, if you're not prioritizing readiness, if you put language in the national security strategy about the scourge of all these maladies and activity in the military, when it doesn't, when it is not the scale of the problem from a statistical perspective, and then you wonder, okay, well, why the hell can't we recruit enough young men and women to serve? I mean, I think that there is this strain of self-loathing and a woke agenda that cuts against real, sensible policy and is distracting at the very least.
Mm-hmm. Neil?
Well, the word competition appears many more times in the new national security strategy than, well, just about any other word, actually. And so the reason I say it's flim-flam is that the nods towards climate change and inclusivity are pretty perfunctory. The guts of the document is, what do we do about China? And I think this is the reason that it's worth our discussing this. In my view, although there are resemblances with HR's radical redrawing of the national security strategy, there's a problem with this document that has nothing to do with what it says on climate or inclusivity. The problem is that while it denies that the US is in a Cold War, it explicitly says we don't want a Cold War, it then proceeds to outline a Cold War strategy in which the war in Ukraine is at least partly a proxy war against Russia. And our goal with respect to China is to prevent China's further technological advance. Not long after the publication of the document, the Commerce Department introduced the most sweeping restrictions on Chinese access to high-end semiconductors. You could call these sanctions without a very obvious provocation, unlike the sanctions on Russia. And my concern, which is what I argued in my most recent Bloomberg opinion column, is that we're pursuing a pretty aggressive strategy in Cold War II. And I'm not sure that it's as subtle as HR's was. I think there's a considerable downside risk to what we're doing. The open-ended nature of the war in Ukraine is a concern to me. I'm not entirely sure what the end game is in the mind of the administration. I know that there's some risk of escalation, though I think that Putin is mostly playing mind games when he talks about nuclear action. But I'm much more concerned about what we're doing with respect to China, because telling China, you cannot progress technologically, we're going to prevent you from having access to the high-end semiconductors, when 92% of those semiconductors are manufactured in, guess where? Taiwan, looks to me like a recipe for a showdown in a relatively tight time frame over that island. I don't know if HR agrees with me, but HR, we've debated this quite a lot on GoodFellows over the years. What worries me is that the Biden administration seems to be in a rather more reckless mode with respect to China than the Trump administration was. I think specifically on the Taiwan question, but more broadly, these are pretty aggressive measures that are being taken here. And of course, it's not coincidental that pretty much at the same moment, we see China's government moving further in the direction of a dictatorship, with Xi Jinping not only clearly dictator for life, but with his cronies entirely dominant on the Politburo Standing Committee. I think there's cause and effect here. Do you agree? Do you agree with me, HR?
Hey, I believe there's cause and effect, but I think it's the opposite of the cause and effect that you're pointing to, Neil. I think that these measures are long overdue because, hey, man, they've always been a dictatorship, and we may have hoped that Xi Jinping's heart was going to grow 2 sizes bigger. That he was going to change. He would no longer be a Leninist, dictator. But that's not going to happen. And I think what's really, I think, laudable about what the administration's done is with these export controls, and especially denying U.S. persons the ability to aid and abet the Chinese Communist Party's agenda. I think that is laudable and long overdue. And the reason is, hey, we all know, investing in China, working with SMIC, working with other Chinese companies, it's not like working with any other international company. I mean, you are aiding and abetting the strategies that the party has put in place to gain a preponderant position of power, not only across the Indo-Pacific region, but globally. And these are, of course, the strategies of military civil fusion. All of these companies must act as an arm of the party, as an arm of the People's Liberation Army. Mm-hmm. And I think that we should have done this a long time ago in terms of export restrictions. I think there needs to be more on outbound investment screening. 2 major U.S. private equity venture capital firms invested in 2014 $700 million in an AI company, which now does all battlefield artificial intelligence for the People's Liberation Army. I mean, hey, how about just not underwriting our own demise? And I think that it's well, past due to take the kind of actions we've seen the administration take. And I think they deserve credit for it. I think, Commerce and BIS did the right things with these export controls. And I know this really cuts against John and free trade, man.
Well, I won't be a free trader on this one. I'll be an is it effective one on this one. This is actually a question. My understanding is fighter jets and missiles don't use 7 nanometer chips. They use older generation, much more robust, tried and true stuff that China knows how to build like everybody else. The point of these chips was to provide the hardware, which then you build advanced computing and AI sorts of stuff. But you don't have to. The real technology is the software, not the hardware. So at least for the moment, China can buy. The idea that we're going to stop China from buying computers onto which it can design AI software I don't think that's going to work out. Sanctions are always easy to get around. So it's not clear to me that stopping them from these kind of chip things is going to be that effective as far as military competition with China. It's effective as far as what kind of high-end devices can they build rather than buy, but not much effect at all on what kind of software they can write.
The critical thing is that the most sophisticated semiconductors China currently has to import. It can't manufacture itself. And we're essentially saying, and nor can you ever, even US persons, that includes green card holders, can't work for Chinese companies in the semiconductor sector. These are quite sweeping measures, and they seem to me to signal that the strategy of the United States is to try to prevent Chinese technological advance, to cut them off from the kind of machinery that you need if you want to make high-end semiconductors. And my counter-argument to you, HR, is not about trade, free or otherwise. It's about the risk that a Cold War escalates and becomes a hot war. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was the closest we came to nuclear war in the whole of the first Cold War. And I think it's now generally realized that that was an extraordinarily dangerous moment, much more dangerous than the public realized at the time. Don't you worry, HR, that this administration is approaching Cold War II in somewhat the same gung-ho manner as we saw at that stage of the Cold War? I wouldn't like to rerun the Cuban Missile Crisis 100 times in a kind of Monte Carlo simulation. I wouldn't expect it to turn out peacefully 100 out of 100 times. And if we're going to rerun it over Taiwan, which I fear we are, isn't there a significant downside risk that we end up with World War III? Are you really saying there's no risk? Just in the same way that imposing sanctions on Japan, cutting Japan off from oil in 1939 to 41, led ultimately to the huge risk that the Japanese took at Pearl Harbor. Is there no scenario in which that doesn't happen in this case?
I want to add to this one, HR, if you will, because this is really important. It ties into what we were doing before. With Ukraine, we're kind of like talking about the immediate actions, but not the long-run strategy. What is the long run strategy? Where does the goal? Similarly with China, here, we're going to punch you in the nose and you can't have semiconductors. Take that, China. Well, let's think, what is the goal fundamentally with China? And does that advance the long run goal? I think that's what we're both questioning here.
And the goals are, I think, to prevent China from gaining a differential advantage over us militarily. In fact, what we've been doing for many years is quite the opposite. We've been helping China develop the most advanced weapons capabilities. Just look at the recent report by Strider Technologies, for example, on Los Alamos, and how technology that has been really taken from Los Alamos and those who work there under the Thousand Talents programs and other forms of espionage has allowed China to maybe gain an advantage over us in hypersonic missiles, for example. So I think that's goal number one. Don't help the Chinese, first of all, right? But take actions that will allow us to maintain our differential competitive advantage technologically from a military perspective. The second, I think, would be is like, hey, don't help China perfect their technologically enabled Orwellian police state, right? What we've done is we've invested U.S. capital in companies like Hikvision, companies like DJI, companies like SenseTime, which have really helped China not only perfect its authoritarian police state internally, but also export it to other countries like Cambodia and Zimbabwe and others. And the third thing I think would be is not to conduct investments in China, really, that is not like making investments in other companies because of the national security law and so forth, that they have to act as an arm of the government, that then jeopardize the long-term viability of your companies. We've seen this with everything from solar panels to wind turbines to battery manufacturing to, you name it, where China then takes that intellectual property that you give them as part of this deal to gain access to the market oftentimes. And then the party, picks a winner, subsidizes that industry. Huawei is a great example of this in terms of 5G communications.
HR, with all due
drives you out of
respect,
business. So what I'm saying is we ought to compete effectively
but this
with
is
that authoritarian mercantilist model.
But this is not what this is. These are export controls. We're not trying to stop investment in China.
I think this is, it has to be not just export controls or not just outbound investment screening. It has to be screening for investments in the United States, the CFIUS process.
So let's talk about the export controls, because I'm with Neil on this.
Controls, why would we sell hardware, for example, to develop microelectronics, to produce microelectronics in China that are key components to weapon systems that the PLA may try to use to kill our grandchildren? I mean, does that make sense to anybody?
But wait a second. HR, you're not addressing the question I asked, with all due respect. Are you telling me that there's no risk that China will launch an invasion against Taiwan in the relatively near future because we are telling it you are either going to accept second-class status technologically or ...
I think you have the cause and effect wrong, Neil. I think the cause and effect is wrong here. And I think that the analogy to to oil in Japan in 1940, 1941 is simplistic.
Why?
I think the highest chance of a conflict with China existed under the cooperation and engagement strategy. How did that turn out? So under the Obama administration, we said, we really want to cooperate with you, and we wish you would just stop these massive cyber attacks against us. We got more cyber attacks. We got island building in the South China Sea.
You've dumped on that a lot, and that's not the question. I want cause and effect. Neil and I want cause and effect. Okay, we say you can't export hold on. You can't export microelectronics to China. What does China say? Oh, well, there goes World War III. I guess we lose. No, they don't do that. One, they might take it over from Taiwan. Two, we might just be telling them, oh, you better really develop that industry domestically like crazy. I have in mind Russia. Russia has no machine tool industry. Why? Because they started buying it from us in the 1990s. They can't build new weapons. They can't build new nuclear weapons because they don't have any machine tools. If we sold it by not selling it to them, the Chinese are either going to grab it in Taiwan, or they're going to spend quadrillions of dollars developing their own. They're not going to sit back and say, we just lost World War III. We want to know what's their response to this.
Well, no, it's not their response. It's what they were doing anyway. This is really what I can't.
What are they going to do?
This is the Made in China 2025 strategy and Xi Jinping's explicit objective of creating the dual circulation economy. And what he meant by that is that he would gain a preponderant advantage in the areas of advanced manufacturing and dominate not only the manufacturing process, but the upstream components and minerals and so forth that are relevant, to the most important hardware and equipment production, in the world, and then pose us with the dilemma of a China that is really insulated from any kind of economic or financial consequences for its aggressive action, while it creates dependencies on us that are quite analogous to the energy dependencies that Russia was able to create on Europe and Germany. That was their explicit strategy. They're not doing this, Neil, in reaction to us. This is the whole thing that I used to deal with, in the early days of the Trump administration. Well, Xi Jinping is just being so, tough because, Donald Trump is so mean. No, it's actually, this is the strategy, that Xi Jinping has set out on from the beginning. And actually, if you look at Roche Doshi's book, The Long Game, this is really what Deng Xiaoping was all about as well, except he was much more subtle about it and in many ways more effective about it.
So just to be clear, you don't think there's any risk at all that China in the relatively near future launches an invasion of Taiwan?
I think actually the danger, it would have been much greater if we had not made the shift from cooperation engagement to transparent competition with China. And I think there are two schools of thought here, Neil, and this is something I think we ought to track and talk more about, in the coming year. Is do you have more to fear from a strong Chinese Communist Party or China under the Chinese Communist Party, or a weak one? And I think you make a case either way. But I think, the conventional wisdom in the Obama years, in fact, President Obama said this explicitly, we have more to fear from a weak China than a strong China. I don't believe that if the China's under Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. And in fact, if China's preoccupied with the problems they have created for themselves in the real estate sector and the ripple effect into the financial sector broadly, with the tech crackdowns, with the zero COVID policies, with their desperation to try to rekindle economic growth, which they're going to fail at doing, dealing with the capital flight. I think you saw maybe the essay in the Financial Times recently. Wealthy Chinese are doing everything the hell they can to activate their escape plans, right? So do you have more to fear from a China that is experiencing this weakness brought upon themselves through their authoritarian mercantilist model, a system that has run its course, that is fundamentally flawed? Or should we try to maybe help make China strong again? I mean, I don't understand that. I think if there is an assault on Taiwan, it's not that we caused it.
Hey, I feel like I'm sailing against a very, very strong tide today. And I just don't know whether it's worth just plugging away. But let me just put up another sail and have another go. This is the administration that utterly failed to avert a war in Eastern Europe that has no end in sight, is causing billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of damage and untold numbers of deaths. This administration failed to deter Putin, in many ways created the conditions in which the war broke out, because it didn't sufficiently arm Ukraine. It didn't take NATO membership off the table. It lifted the sanctions on Nord Stream 2. And here we are. And this same administration now ratchets up the economic pressure on a China that is clearly moving in an illiberal direction, away from any kind of openness towards the West. Look, we just witnessed a scene from a Cold War, a scene even from the days of Mao Zedong, the utter humiliation of Hu Jintao at the closing ceremony of the party congress. And as an historian, I tell you, this is not a good look, because wars don't begin when countries like the People's Republic of China feel confident. They begin when they feel that they're losing their ground, that their position is worsening, that time is not on their side. And that is the situation that Xi Jinping is now in. It's a situation very like Germany 1914. It's a situation like Germany 1939. It's a situation like Japan 1941. And I don't think you're nearly worried enough about what happens if this move is made. Because if you think the war in Ukraine made a mess of the world economy, I promise you a war over Taiwan would be absolutely cataclysmic. And no matter how morally superior you felt, you could be on GoodFellows telling me that it's all Xi Jinping's fault. If the war happens, I believe it will be partly the result of inept American national security, not just because of
I would say if it happens, Neil, it's because of a perception of weakness, not because of a perception of strength. Weakness is provocative. That's the case.
I don't disagree about that, but this is the worst combination.
I would, on Ukraine, I said this before, it's almost like we were greenlighting the invasion, with the lack of activity and actions to strengthen deterrence there. So, hey, why don't we do that across the Indo-Pacific and vis-a-vis China? We should be doing that. We need to do it economically, as I mentioned, but we do need to do more on the defense front as well. But I'll tell you, Neil, but when it comes down to it, the person who is to blame for the invasion of Ukraine is not Joe Biden. I think it seems like John Mearsheimer's throwing his voice right now. It's actually Vladimir Putin, who actually is to blame for that. And I do think that, what is provocative to China is weakness. Okay, think about this. 2013, right? Yang Jiechi goes to the ASEAN or APAC, I can't remember which one it was. And he says, hey, we're a big country, you're little countries. Get used to it, is what he's talking to the countries across the Indo-Pacific. They begin to build islands in the South China Sea and weaponize them. There's a whole series of aggressive actions that happen in the wake of that, ramming Vietnamese vessels and sinking them. We all know what's happened since COVID, bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death in the Himalayan frontier and so forth. Massive campaigns of economic coercion against Australia, against Estonia, for example. But did we cause that? I don't think so. And so if we've seen the threats to Taiwan, we saw the massive kind of pseudo blockade or telegraphing a blockade associated with Speaker Pelosi's visit. Did we cause all that, or does Xi Jinping already decide that he wants to do it?
Their perception that we won't do anything about it matters.
Well, it does. You're absolutely right. Deterrence is capability times will. And the Chinese Communist Party assesses, just like Putin assessed, what are their capabilities? What is the will?
Okay, let's move on. Let's move on, fellas.
You know what?
Let's move on,
not
fellas.
the economy. It's not the economy that is influenced by the Phillies' performance. It is HR's motivation to talk the rest of us into exhaustion on GoodFellows.
I think you're making the Phillies lead.
I'm starting to feel like an Iraqi
to recession argument.
Okay.
I'm a Cubs fan, so
Okay, moving on, folks. Moving on. So, John Cochrane, part of what's driving Red October is voters' vast dissatisfaction with the current state of the American economy. You can see Republicans in 2023 with control of half or both bodies of Congress doing all kinds of showy things, dragging Janet Yellen up to the Hill, embarrass her, bringing up Jerome Powell, and so forth. But what can the Republicans really do in the way of policy, John, to show that they understand inflation, they get it?
Well, there's inflation and there's all the sand in the gears of our own economic policy. Inflation does, I'm Mr. Fiscal Theory, the price level. So getting the fiscal house in order, I think, is important inflation. I don't think Republicans have any more taste for that than Democrats, because it involves, tackling entitlements. The deficit is down, but it's still $1 trillion a year. And this will be a moment, but I don't see much will for doing much on the macro policy issues. The micro policy issues are actually the more interesting ones. Democrats have kind of woken up to the fact that real estate zoning restrictions and real estate restrictions are responsible for housing going up. Republicans have flipped, and now they're the ones who say, no, we must let communities stop all building going on. That's kind of an interesting one. The whole question of, Democrats, climate advocates have figured out we can't put in transmissions lines because the National Environmental Quality Act lets you stop any construction anywhere. And if we're going to have an existential crisis, the fact that it takes 10 years to get the permits for a transmission line, that kind of slows down the fact that we're all supposed to be driving electric cars 10 years from now, and there's nowhere to power them from. Those are the kind of small things. Now, I think, one place to really look, energy policy looks to me as one that we really, let's talk about microeconomic policies. We are in a crazy energy policy. The Democrats, in the name of climate, have basically, their policy is turn off fossil fuels now before we have something to replace it. You can see how well that's working. Climate's important, but there's a sane policy that has benefits and costs and science and does things in the order that can possibly be done, recognizes that nuclear works and so forth. Will we tilt to that? That is, I think, a big opportunity for Democrats, but for Republicans. But it's being ensconced in lots of ways. So we never passed legislation on this stuff. For example, the National Security Directive says, climate change is the most important thing. We got to make the tanks battery powered. Financial regulation, the SEC is writing all sorts of regulations to force companies basically to shut down the fossil fuel companies, and you can see the result. Now, we can look out the window and see how catastrophic it is. Will this get ensconced through the regulations, through the administrative state? Will the Republicans be able to do something about it? That seems one that I think, that fixing the schools that Neil mentioned that. So where I see the possibility on a serious change in economic policy is on this microeconomic, get the sand out of the gears part of it. They should be fixing taxes and inflation. I just don't think they will.
I think this is where there's a missed opportunity a little bit too by this administration. I mean, in terms of, they talk about integrating defense or national security or foreign policy and domestic policy. Well, how about in the energy space, right? I mean, they've done a lot of things that make no darn sense in terms of permitting and infrastructure associated with our ability to maybe help solve some of the problems associated with the global energy demand. Global energy demand is going to go up 50% between now and 2050. The most renewables are going to be able to deliver of that is about 28%. And so without making the investments in infrastructure, we're really denying ourselves the ability to be part of that solution. And of course, with the transition to natural gas from coal and other forms of energy that are less or more carbon intensive, I think is a big part of the solution.
Mm-hmm. Neil?
I have nothing to say on this subject.
Well, let me give you something.
This is amazing. We've finally found something.
We've warned Neil to enough.
Neil has nothing to say on it.
Well, Neil, let me give you something you will have an opinion on. Much in the spirit of dragging Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell up to the hill, you can see Republicans dragging Tony Fauci up to the hill to have a pound of his flesh over COVID. But there is a serious conversation to be had about public health policy moving forward. So as the author of Doom, what is your advice to Republicans on how to proceed on the public health front?
Well, we really do need to take stock, don't we? Because we've come through one of the great public health disasters of modern times in the United States. It's not the only public health disaster, though, because if you look at the dent that has been inflicted on life expectancy in this country, actually the opioid epidemic, which is peculiar to the United States, has done even more damage. There's something terribly wrong with public health in America. I was looking at the statistics for California, perhaps the most successful economy in the world, certainly would be up there if it were a nation state, but its public health's atrocious. And it's not as if we don't spend money on healthcare. We spend more than almost any other country relative to GDP. So, yeah, we should go back and ask what mistakes were made in 2020 and in 2021. The mistakes were just about as bad in 2021 because we had the vaccines most of that year and still the death toll rose. But I think we need to ask a broader question, and that is, why is life expectancy falling in the United States, the most powerful country in the world with the largest economy? Why has, for year upon year, the death toll from opioid overdoses gone up? In some ways, that's a more worrying question because it's been an American phenomenon and it's dragged on for much longer than COVID.
Mm-hmm. John?
So Neil is spot on here. We have to remember, let's go back to the political question you asked. What if the Russians take over? Well, let's try that again. What if the Republicans take over? Oh, God forbid the Russians take over. What if the Republicans take over? Well, they take over the House and the Senate and some governorships maybe, but what tools do they have? They can't pass laws because Biden can veto them and they can't pass over vetoes. So what actual tools do they have? Well, the tool of investigation, I think, is the most potent one. And I expect we'll see a lot of that. We should, the FDA and the CDC, what the heck went wrong? What went wrong with all of our public health that is now in cover your butt mode to defend whatever we did rather than learn from experience and get ready for the next pandemic? What went wrong with Afghanistan? We started talking about where's the inquiry on Afghanistan? What's going on with the schools? Inflation. How could the Federal Reserve have possibly missed 9% inflation? Where is the inquiry commission on that one? Local ones. California, back to energy. California's wildfires in 2020 alone wiped out all of the carbon that all of its carbon policies ever saved. Maybe if we had allowed them to cut down those trees, sequester them in houses and grow new trees, that wouldn't happen. You can do this kind of inquiry on the local level at all. What's going on in our I just recently saw the NIH is not sponsoring research that doesn't accord with its view of what is politically correct research. What's going on in the granting age? So the power to investigate what's going on in the FBI, Department of Justice, and so forth. These are more political, but nonetheless, as a rule of law person, I'm kind of unhappy to see them turn political. So I do think that is probably the lever of power that they have the greatest ability to use, and I'll be interested to see where they use it.
Okay, so you just gave me about a half a dozen various things they can investigate, if not more. So prioritize it. Where do you start?
All at once. You start where you think you can make some. I'm an economist, so I want to investigate the economic ones, but the functioning of government ones I think are very important. How is it administered? So let's investigate the SEC and what they're doing on imposing climate regulation that is none of their bloody business. So I start with all of the above because I'm terrible at prioritizing. That's why I'm an academic.
Right. Okay, Neil, one element of a party taking over power in Congress is throwing red meat to the base. So how do the Republicans avoid going after Hunter Biden? How do Republicans avoid going down the same impeachment road as Democrats with Trump and Republicans with Clinton?
That's a very political question.
Yes.
And I'm not sure as a professor of history, I'm competent to answer it. If professors of history ran America, the first thing the Republicans would do if they gain control of the House, whether they gain control of the Senate or not,
right,
would be to say to the American people, the country has a chronic fiscal crisis. John Cochrane has written eloquently about the relationship between that fiscal crisis and our inflation problem. It's time for both parties to stop pretending that modern monetary theory is true and that debts and deficits don't matter. They do. The United States will soon spend more on debt interest than it spends on defense when it faces a more formidable opponent than it faced in the first Cold War. This is something HR and I can agree on. And we need to stop playing the kind of politics that's characterized our behavior really since the end of the first Cold War. A politics in which election results are contested, often in frivolous ways, and this happens on both sides. A politics in which impeachment is a substitute for debate. That dates back to the Clinton years. It's time for Americans to get serious. And that requires a bipartisan consensus, not just on the nature of the threat from China and Russia. It needs a bipartisan consensus on fiscal reform. It needs a bipartisan consensus on immigration reform. It needs a bipartisan consensus on the kind of structural reforms that will make the economy once again the dynamic engine of growth that it needs to be. That's what should be said by the leader of the Republican Party, however the midterms result. And it's what the Democratic leadership should say too. Mm-hmm. Is that going to happen? No, probably not. But that's because professors don't rule the world.
But let me chime in. That was beautiful, Neil. And other than just repeating what you said, the fiscal situation is the huge problem. And when that invasion of Taiwan happens, when all trade in the Pacific is cut off, there's going to be a sovereign fiscal crisis like you've never seen. We're going into this war with 100% debt to GDP ratio. But yes, what the Republicans should do, I'll put them on my HR, tell them to do what they should do. Not, hey, we get to go after Hunter Biden. Not, we're going to do unto them like they did unto us, double. No more. What they should do is we're going to reestablish the norms of constitutional government. We're not going to show up double or nothing on this bet. We're going to go back to running things the way they're supposed to be run. Even if it's not going to be bipartisan, we're just going to show by example how you obey proper norms of doing things, and hopefully voters see competence. I think what we all want to see is just mind the store, rule of law, constitutional competence, not lead us off onto some grand new crusade to somewhere else. If they could just display basic competence, then I think they would stay in power for a long time, much longer than going after Hunter Biden or whatever else.
Mm-hmm. HR?
I think focus on outcomes, and I like John's point about really taking advantage of the opportunity to strengthen confidence in our institutions. When we had Yuval Levin on here, man, he did a great job, I think, in terms of describing, what ails our institutions and Americans' confidence in them. And then also what needs to be done. And he actually prioritized Congress. He said Congress is probably the first institution I'll try to get its act together and can maybe set examples for others. And then, I do think that, focusing on outcomes, right? How do we prepare for the next pandemic or biomedical crisis, right? What have we learned? And then, and we've done this in the past. I mean, I'm thinking of a couple examples. Goldwater Nichols after Vietnam, which directed some of the restructuring of the joint staff and joint education, I think had a profound and positive impact on national defense. Another example might be, remember the election reforms that were undertaken after the 2000 election. Bill, you know a heck of a lot more about this than I do, but it was very bipartisan, and I think it strengthened confidence in our electoral processes. Can you imagine that happening now? It's probably difficult to imagine now, but I do think that maybe all of us can demand from our leaders, that they act in all of our interests and they focus on outcomes. I think that would be, extremely positive for the country.
Can I just riff on HR here? Hey, you take over Congress, got a limited power to do anything else. Why don't you start by fixing Congress? Let's go back to regular order. Let's go back to actually having subcommittee hearings where you hash out what the laws are. You don't show up with 2,000 pages 5 minutes before it's gone and say, vote yes or no. Let's actually pass some individual laws that individually make sense. Let's pass laws instead of, the Department of Energy shall figure out what to do to save our existential crisis. Let's actually, pass some laws that have something. The Supreme Court is telling Congress, wake up, do your job. Well, wake up, do your job. There is actually, I think, a point in passing laws that Biden won't sign. You at least have a blueprint of what's ready to go if only you get a different signature there. So make Congress back what it's supposed to be, I think, is the number one thing they could do.
John, what about members of Congress trading stock?
That's a very bad idea. And, if people would only show some decency, we wouldn't need a lot of rules. But members of Congress have allowed themselves to trade stock on inside information in ways in which, if you're running a Burger King and you trade stock on what you know about the cow market, you go to jail. So it's sad that we need to put in rules against that sort of thing.
Sounds good. Neil, what about term limits?
Term limits for legislators or presidents?
Term limits for legislators.
Terrible idea.
I don't think it's a good idea. Part of the problem that blew the British political and economic situation up in the past weeks was inexperience. Mm-hmm. And I'm a believer in experience. The whole notion that there's some kind of a finite amount of time that somebody's good for dates back in many ways to the Republican Party's fearing another Franklin Roosevelt. Now, you have to admit, Franklin Roosevelt was a pretty good president. How would things have turned out if he'd only had 2 terms in office? Do the counterfactual.
How about John Quincy Adams, as president and a long-term representative?
So I think term limits is an idea that makes even less sense than it did in the past, given our longer life expectancy and generally better health. That's not to say that we want octogenarians in the White House, though. And I think the real focus that we need to bring to bear here is not on some naive rule, some simplistic one-size-fits-all rule on how long political careers should be. I think we need to ask questions about whether individuals are still capable of performing the offices of senator, congressman, or for that matter, president. I think there's pretty good reason to believe that Joe Biden is too old to be president. I don't think I'm saying anything here that's really very controversial. Right. And when 2024 comes around, I hope we have youthful candidates. That's not about term limits. That is about capacity to perform the most onerous job in the world.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, let me chime in. So the idea behind term limits is that you don't trust democracy. Right. You think that the voters are too damn dumb to vote somebody out after that person has become corrupt, ensconced, bought off, or whatever. So you need to put in a rule to kick people out no matter what. Well, let's fix what you think is wrong with democracy there. In the end, I'm the economist, competition is always the answer. The ability of somebody to see what's wrong with a candidate, explain what's wrong with the candidate, and win the next election is the right answer if you think somebody's getting too ensconced. Here, I think, campaign finance laws are actually hurting because one way in which you can challenge a newcomer is to get a lot of money and challenge an incumbent and challenge someone who has all the advantages of office. The other problem with term limits is that the minute someone's facing a term limit, they're a lame duck. And I think that's been a problem of our presidential policy. The right answer was it was always possible to serve more terms, but nobody thought they were better than Washington. And so they chose not to do it. But the possibility of doing it kept them powerful in their second term in office. Now we have 1 4-year term where something happens, and then 4 years where we're waiting for the next 4 years. And our founders didn't put them in for a reason. They studied history. I know in the history of the Florentine Republic, they had term limits. They didn't trust elections, so they had lots. The Medici screwed with the lots anyway. But anyway, they had it by sort of randomly who got to be in office, and then you're only in for a year. And that did not work well at all. So there's long experience with term limits, with distrust in voters, and the answer is that doesn't really work. Democracy works, but it has to have that competition to work.
Final question. We'll go quickly around the horn. The dog catches the car. Republicans have control of half, if not all, of Congress. Is this a good thing or a bad thing, John Cochrane?
Oh, well, you get to whine and complain if you stay out of power.
Right.
And you're faced with, you caught the car, now you got to do something if you're in power. Let's face it, we're back to divided government for 4 years. So don't count on, even if my brand of free market Republican takes over, there's not much you can do as Congress. But right now, a divided government is probably a good thing to hope for, to hold back the excesses of the administration, to see every executive order, to see every illegal usurpation of an administrative agency, to just hold in the craziness and hold your breaths and have a chance to show that you have a governing program and philosophy ready to go the next time around.
HR?
Well, I think it's a great opportunity to reestablish regular order. I think that would be one of the major priorities, especially in defense. And I think defense needs a lot of help in terms of not even more spending on addressing the bow wave of deferred modernization or capacity issues, but especially on multi-year contracting and the ability to put more predictability into the defense budget that will allow us to do sensible things in connection with the industrial base and refilling some of the stockpiles that we've drawn down with assistance to Ukraine. So I'm hoping that there's a real focus on defense as maybe a place to get some bipartisan support. There always has been there already, but reestablishing regular order with an emphasis on the defense budget and really getting over the hangover we have associated with the Budget Control Act and sequestration, which really forced the department to waste a lot of money, and to not build in some of the new capabilities that are going to be quite important for responding to conflict, but also to deterring China and others.
Neil, you get the last word.
Well, it's only going to be a good thing if they say what I said earlier in the show. So that's simple enough. Can I take a moment just to very briefly pay my respects and invite you all to pay your respects to my old friend Ash Carter, who suddenly and very unexpectedly died today at the age of just 68. Ash was Defense Secretary 2015 to 17. He was one of those exceptional people who combines a distinguished academic career culminating in directing the Belfer Center at Harvard's Kennedy School with being a really tireless public servant. He was one of those people who really embodied for me Republican virtue. And I don't mean that in the partisan sense. I mean that in the sense of he served the American Republic and he served it energetically and creatively, bringing his wisdom to bear as a trained physicist to problems of national security. And I'm still reeling a bit, probably why I've been subdued on this call by the news of his untimely death.
Right. A Hoover Distinguished Visiting Fellow, also a fellow at the Spoli Institute at Stanford. HR, your thoughts?
Yeah, he'll be missed tremendously. I really thought it was a privilege for me to know him over the years. I audited his and Bill Perry's class when I was here at Hoover as a National Security Affairs Fellow in 2002 to 2003. That's when I first met him. I learned at that point about the instrumental role that he played in helping to dismantle the nuclear arsenals of the Soviet Union in the former Soviet republics, including Ukraine. And then, I found him over the years to be an extraordinarily empathetic person. He's a person, as Neil said, has combined extraordinary competencies as a physicist, but then also in the areas of policy and strategy. but I always found him to be an extraordinary listener, and he was very engaging, and he also had a great sense of humor. And he's a fellow Philadelphian, and so I'm going to miss Ash tremendously, and I'm grateful for the opportunity of knowing him and to have benefited from his knowledge and then also from his example over the years.
Mm-hmm. John, anything you'd like to add?
I did not. I don't travel in such high circles as you guys, so I did not know Ash. But I'm reminded of George Schultz, who lamented often the difficulty of getting great people to serve our country these days. And it sounds like we lost one, and it would be good to try to think how we can get great public servants to serve again.
Well said. Our condolences to Ash Carter's family and to all of those who had the pleasure of working with him these many years. And that's it for this episode of GoodFellows. We will be back next week. You do not want to miss our next episode. It'll be Stephen Kotkin talking Russia and China, I imagine. To make sure you don't miss the show, subscribe to our show. Sign up for us. And by the way, give us a review or two. We like getting all kinds of stars here. You can also sign up for Hoover's Daily Report, which anytime John, Neil, and HR in the news, you'll find out yourself. It comes to your inbox every weekday. On behalf of Hoover's GoodFellows, Niall Ferguson, John Cochrane, the insufferable Philadelphian HR McMaster, all of us here at the Hoover Institution, we hope you enjoyed today's conversation. We'll see you next week. Take care.
If you enjoyed this show and are interested in watching more content featuring HR McMaster, watch Battlegrounds, also available at hoover.org.